So what I'd like to do this evening is put forth the concept as I did last week, where I started with seeing truth, because I think that summarized very much a good amount of what book one was gearing us to look at. So the question I have is, so what can we really do for each other except just love each other and be each other's witness? And haven't we got the right to hope for more so that we can really stretch into whoever we really are? And the reason I put that forward is I do know a little bit more about the history of this book on a personal level. And I wanted to put that forward now so you can begin to think about why you connected or didn't connect, and all kinds of reasons why you probably will begin to get some new thoughts about that. When he wrote this book, and as we shared last week, this book was the one that took the longest for him to finish. He started it in Paris, and then he didn't finish it until 1961, December, in Istanbul, Turkey. The book is dedicated to Mary Painter. And if you look at all of his work, you will see that in the dedications and in the forwards and in the choice comments that he uses at the beginning of most of what he created, they all are very personal. They all have something to do very profoundly with his life, as does all of his literature. Mary Painter was an extraordinary woman who was one of Jimmy's closest friends. She was the one woman who he always said, if he could have married her, he would, but he couldn't. She was an economist. She worked on the Marshall Plan. She was an extraordinary statistician. And she moved, she worked in Paris for a long, long time, but she finally moved there in 1950 is when Jimmy met her. And she ended up marrying one of the most well-known chefs in Paris, Georges Garand. And they settled in Toulouse after they closed their very well-known restaurant in Paris. She was also, besides being a brilliant statistician and an economist who did extraordinary statistical analyses, even dealing with the Nazi warships and all kinds of historical things that mattered. She was a great cook. So she fell in love with Georges. They got married and they went to live in Toulon in the west from Nice, to give you a perspective on where that is. And then until he died, and he, Mary was originally from Minneapolis, so she was an American who then moved later on there. So when you think about how he did that, when you think about how everything he did later on in using the quotes, and now I'll take you to the concept of Conrad's quote at the beginning, which is about loneliness. And when you revisit that quote, you think about loneliness, I want you to think about how are all these characters lonely? And what does loneliness mean to you? And how does loneliness play out in this entire piece of work? There is also another interesting personal connection to Jimmy and Mary, and that is Buford Delaney, who is now quite well known in the world, thank goodness. But he was one of Jimmy's closest friends, and I mentioned him last session. And Jimmy looked up to him as a mentor, as a friend, and he met him when he was still in high school. And Buford was 14, 15 years older than him. And at the time, Buford was living in the village, and he always said that he helped him see light, see color, see art, and so on. But there's a wonderful painting that Buford created called, beside doing a lot of portraits of Jimmy as well, entitled Making Peace with Aloneness. And to me, when I looked at that painting recently that a friend of mine in Paris posted, because she runs and created an extraordinary effort to bring Buford's body back to a cemetery where people could visit it, and to also run what she calls Les Amis de Buford, Friends of Buford. And as a result of that, she puts on a lot of events in Paris, taking people on tours of places where a lot of writers and artists made their homes in Paris, but also she cared greatly about Buford's work because she was so taken with it. And as a result, she works with people in Knoxville, Tennessee, who are turning the whole city into a tribute to him. And I did go to that 2 years ago when they did it. And it was a week of celebration of Buford and Jimmy's friendship throughout the city of Knoxville. And the entire city now has an extraordinary collection of his work, which is managed by his the lawyer who runs the estate of Buford. And they're recreating the house that Buford grew up in with his brother. So I tell you all of this because all of this helps you frame and consider the extraordinary range of Jimmy's life, the kind of friends that he had, the kind of people who mattered to him, the kind of friends he had throughout his entire life. And they were all different. They were all different identities of every sort and mix. And that is, again, testimony to the kind of personal, extraordinary human being he was, which is why he became an extraordinary writer. Buford helped him also opening up about light, truth, how to see. So what I wanted to ask all of you was, how do you feel about loneliness in your life? How do you feel about loneliness in these characters and alienation? And when you think about the fact that book one, Rufus felt that despairing, that he was that desperately lonely and could not carry on, and therefore took his own life. I think he partly did that because he was at the bottom and he couldn't see beyond it. But how do the rest of the characters deal with their own feelings as we move into book two, which I'll go into some more, but I wanted to throw that out initially to see if any of you have any thoughts about what I so far have said. Richard.
Well, there I am. Actually, I hate to make marks in books, but I dog-eared a page earlier. Let me find it. And this goes with the loneliness of the characters, and it also is one of those places where you're reading along with the story, with the book, you're piecing it together, and then an arm almost comes out of the page and slaps you, right?
Yeah.
And it could, only have to, mean anything to me, or it could be with other people. I'm sorry, I'm just looking. Okay. The trouble with the secret life is that it is very frequently a secret from the person who lives it, and not at all a secret for the people he encounters. And I kept going back to that sentence, and I kept thinking that loneliness is really that kind of disassociation, because we're lonely from ourselves, right? We aren't necessarily lonely because of other people. You know, it's, you know, there's that element where we are just, we feel isolated, and we feel isolated for reasons that only other people know. Right? You know, it's like, you know, like, no kidding. But but anyway, I kept going into that with the self, with the image of self, the projected self, and with the reality being in between, and with the reality often being seen only by someone else. You know, you could kind of oversimplify it by saying that you have to go to a shrink to figure out what you're thinking, right? You know, but that sentence really kind of struck me, and I had to sit with that for quite a while. And I am still sitting with it. So maybe that addresses in some way what you were talking about.
Yes, and it happens to be one of the ones that I put a little sticky on.
Okay.
Because I also think it is a profound sentence. So taking it further, and I hope some more of you will comment. When you think about innocence in terms of loneliness, what does that really mean? And it speaks to something that Richard was just implying as well. If we're not going to figure out by ourselves why we're lonely, and if we're going to remain, quote, innocent or ignorant, you know, the popular concept willfully ignorant that people talk about endlessly everywhere, it's really about this too. So think about innocence in terms of working through loneliness. We are all responsible for working through why we are the way we are and how to deal with individual and collective loneliness. That is something that he has said, has written, and I know he thought. Love can bridge the expanse between loneliness and become the telescope that brings another person's life closer, and the scope and view of it can magnify the meaning of one's entire world. And just you said, love is light's battle until we die. What makes us love certain people and certain things? How and why does that change during our life? How does loss and grief and wounds affect our openness and our vulnerability to love? And we ended last session beginning to talk about love. And love is the most important thing in every piece of work he wrote. It is a different interpretation in every piece he wrote. It plays out differently in an essay versus a short story versus a novel, and so on. But can some of the rest of you think about how that relates to you in terms of this particular work, but also any other thoughts you want to share about another country and feeling alienated or not? Yes, Sung.
Because everyone is listening, I love to talk. Personally, I think when you don't love other people, you feel lonely, like you are shutting down yourself against others. That's my one way of thinking. Also, I don't know, but there's a nature which I think is so easy to relate and, you know, open your heart and love, because nature is, I think, really giving and blessing. But the characters in the novel, like they have no connection. Seems like they lost connection with nature, where they can be, you know, just relax and, you know, get loved by nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have some thoughts, Carol.
Yeah.
Joanne. One of the things in some ways, I don't know if it has much to do with loneliness as just being discomfort with awareness of self and how you think or believe other people view you. One of the people who was on last week talked a lot about seeing Baldwin or else his book as having some aspect of religion or spirituality in it. And I read all of book one and was getting into book two. And one of the things I was thinking about that relates to loneliness was that Rufus was almost like the sacrificial lamb who in his death, everybody is getting some insight about themselves in relation to what their relationship was with him. And Rufus was probably in some ways one of the most honest of them all about himself. And it was that honesty in terms of what he was sensing or feeling that he couldn't live with, that eventually led to his demise, because not only could he not heal himself, nobody else that he was in connection with could fill that hole up inside of him either, in the same way that they can't fill it up inside of themselves. But in the second book, it seems like they're coming to more of a reckoning, a realization of it in themselves, which was something that Rufus had already done. So in terms of my own sense of loneliness, I am very comfortable being with myself, so that what I feel happens a lot of time, and I saw in this book too, you can be lonely in a crowd as well as by yourself.
Mhm.
If you don't have some sense of comfort or peace within yourself, and that this story talks a lot about that in terms of what happens with people when they don't have that. And as the last thing, I think of what the preacher said at the funeral, that there's a lot of dead people walking around, and if there weren't so many, we wouldn't all have to suffer so much. And
Yeah.
that's what I think we're seeing happen to Rufus, was that he suffered from the dead people around him and the deadness in himself.
Spot on. Other thoughts?
I was thinking about Rufus's death as a representation of the times where people were just dying from heroin overdose, and he committed suicide, but all these other people that start using drugs and die of alcoholism and everything, it's similar. So he was like a symbol of that. And was James Baldwin religious? Because when that topic came up, I don't really know that much about him, but I've just come into religion, not, like crazy, but God is love. And, like he doesn't mention God, I don't think, in any of his books. And if he does not, like supporting it. But, this just made me think you can't be lonely if you believe in God, because that's what it says, like you're never alone. So though this pandemic has made us dig in deeper about loneliness, without God, in my opinion, you don't really feel that other loneliness, or whatever the term lonely means to anybody. It's personal. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Thank you. Yes.
Just thinking about the question of the character's loneliness, and I think it's loneliness and also alienation, or loneliness in the context of the society that they live in and how the society views them, and in not such accepting ways. So, I mean, the strongest representation of that is the extreme racism that enrages Rufus and his sister. And then the other kind of loneliness that, say, Eric and Vivaldo experience coming of age in their various contexts. Were very homophobic and racist South that he wasn't fitting into, and then Vivaldo, kind of an unforgiving family, which suffering, having to deal with extreme poverty. So really working class white Italian family, but sort of these how, and the same with Eve, kind of alienation and loneliness he felt vis-a-vis his mother, and kind of growing up in those really difficult circumstances. So I think it's like this personal loneliness, and what's so interesting is how I feel like this book could have been written today. You know, you think this was like 1961, but like kind of the openness, and how, you know, how people are grappling with like how this Black woman and white man could negotiate race in their relationship, and then the characters, you know, bisexuality, and like trying to find that that place of comfort and sense of home, and so it's like very beautiful when, even though it's a fleeting, well, no, that's book 3, I'm sorry. Let me shut up. That's it.
We'll get there too.
I couldn't put it down.
Good. Any other thoughts?
Hi, I have a quick thought. Hi, good evening, everyone. It just was mentioned earlier if James Baldwin was religious, and actually he was a preacher when he was like a teen, from like 14, about 17 years of age. So
Right.
just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you. I
You're
was
welcome.
going to bring that in, but thank you for doing that. Yeah. He grew up, his stepfather was a Pentecostal minister, and he went and became one in a different church for approximately 2 years when he was 14. So he very much was active in that kind of a storefront church experience. However, the whole concept of what's the difference between church, religion, and the way it plays out in the world, personally and politically, very much resonates throughout much of his work for all the obvious reasons. And in this book in particular, he brings it in a lot when Ida is performing. And what does she sing? She sings his favorite hymn, Precious Lord. She sings Just Above My Head. And Just Above My Head is the name of his later book. You know, so if you look at all his work, the background, the roots are all in your face in some form or another, and they're all connected, and they're all very much experiences that he lived through, worked through, and then made different decisions about. However, the way in which he felt about the church much later on was extremely a mix of anger, disappointment, giving it up, and then deciding that he was no longer going to believe in it in any way because he felt that it fed racism and that not enough was done to help people to stop lying to each other. And he took that on globally as well as in this country, and it was with him until he passed. But it mattered greatly because it resonates everywhere in his life. It's just he did, and of course, the identity issues were major as well, in the way in which he was looked upon horribly by a lot of people because he was a gay man, and he was a man who said, "I'll love who I want, and it's none of your business." And so all of those issues resonate when you look at the challenges around, do you believe in a religion? Do you believe in the church? Do you believe in something that's going to exclude you or include you? And so on and so on. And he was more concerned not with those things, nor with harping on them, but instead about how do you live the best moral, honorable, honest life you can, and how do you become the best writer you can. So much of that drove his journey in life.
But along with that, Carol, I had a question and a comment that I'm going to make in relation to that. Again, to me, it goes back to his honesty, because he wanted the church, and it's so timely for today, to live up to what it claims to be, as well as America, to live up what it claims to be. And that was something that, that Martin Luther King used to talk about as well, too. So there was this aspect, and I think, and it's so timely why his writing is so timely today, when you see what's being done, say, even in the evangelical and conservative religious movements and everything, where they're just condemning everything which is not what church is supposed to be about. But we know historically has happened in various ways. And as well as you have people really live out the ideals of their faith in God and everything as well too. And so again, I see that kind of tension going on in the story and in these characters. And as I got into book 2, I'm anxious to see what happens with Ida, because it seems like she is, like kind of living up to some of that more so, and through her relationship with her brother, that there was something embedded in her that's coming out.
Yes. Very insightful, and I think quite accurate. Yes.
I know this is in book 3, but I think if we could come back to it when we're there, to go to the comment that where Ida's describing her father's reaction at her brother's funeral, and the mother, I don't have the quotes and I have to look back for it, but the mother says something about pray, and he has a very explosive rejection of that idea. So I think that that could be seen as kind of the perspective of Baldwin in that situation.
Sharp. I think you're right on there. Other thoughts, feelings? Yep.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
Did I jump in? No, I'll wait.
Well, I've just wanted to. I'm kind of resonating with the narrator of the novel. Who is. I see observing and being able to name for us. Like I wanted to, your earlier question about, so what can we really do for each other except love each other and be each other's witness? What does that entail? I think is naming and defining. And one of the pleasures I have of this book is really to be in the trusted embrace of the narrator, as the narrator names these aspects, in characters' lives that they don't see themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I was reacting in a similar way. They were telling me as the story unfolds and they conflict and things start to come out about their relationship. So thank you. Alexis.
Yes. I actually wanted to bring that particular thing up, particularly when it comes to like Richard. It's interesting to me how he goes outside of his relationship with his wife and children to get validation, or to get or even the community at large who doesn't even know him personally, to be able to exist. And when he's with his family, he's so dismissive, or and I'm wondering if that's because he feels as though other people will dismiss his real feelings about things, or his thoughts. And I mean, and it may be actually true, because his wife was kind of just that's not real, in his book, or even Vivaldo was kind of just I want to say it's a good book, but I'd be lying. And it's who is this guy who also has all these opinions about how other people are feeling. It's like, you don't really feel that, like, that's not real. Or like, even when like Ida was talking about her feelings about her brother even being found, like he was just like, the police don't do that. Like, it was like, what world are you in, guy? Like, so I mean, there are pockets of visibility and invisibility in these relationships, and even in the first book, where you feel sorry for everybody because they're just like clinging to even like the littlest bit of attention, or even running away from it, like even with like Vivaldo, like ran away from that party. And I was just like, that's weird. Like, I didn't understand what he was running from, but I feel like also he was running from Ida's attention, and the possibility of him actually not being worthy of her attention or love, which would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, I mean, I haven't gone to the second part, but I'm sure, like, I was just reading the names and I was like, oh no, we get to meet Eric. Oh, this is going to be interesting. So I'm ready for that.
Great. Thank you. But yeah, Richard does, I think I agree with you, plays this severely critical and clueless on so many levels person, but it's representative of so many people, if we think about our own lives, who have no clue, no want to know who we really are, how we feel, and so on. And he's just lashing out throughout until later, when he has to deal with the reality of his entire protected life falling apart as his relationship changes drastically with Cass, and therefore also the rest of the people in the whole novel. Richard, you were going to say something?
Well, after being distracted a little bit and then coming back and hearing you say that Richard is completely clueless, I thought you were talking about me, but no, which would be accurate. But but no, it's I was going back to something that Anna talked about with loneliness and other things that were going on, and I was just trying to think about the concept of what is the difference between, and I think we've all grappled with this 100 times, but what is the difference between being alone and what is the difference between being lonely? And you know, if you feel as though that you have a companion in God or the spirits or the tree wimps or whatever they are, you know, then you are never really alone. But does that necessarily mean that you aren't lonely? So that was just it was going back a little bit, and it was just to pick up on your conversation to flesh that out a little bit more. And so it's not of primary importance. I'm, you know, more insulted that you're calling me, you know, clueless while I'm looking aside from the screen.
All right, you're King Richard, okay?
King Richard, very, very, very apropos to today. Right. Other thoughts?
But that was it.
One or two people we haven't heard from want to share or comment or jump in? Okay, I'll move us along then. So we moved to the and again, I'm doing this partly summation because I know everybody's had different challenges this week and may not have read as much as you might have liked to, but so we go into the south of France. Eric and Eve are introduced in their relationship at any rate, and they're there for 2 months and in a rented house, and they're going to go back to, well, going back to Paris. Eve is going back to Paris, and Eric's going back home, back to New York, on the boat, because that, you know, that in those days, that was what was the way to go. So they had begun to have their mutual dwelling place, as he names it, which I think is kind of interesting because it speaks to what the relationship started at. And so I wanted you to think about, how can these differences, now we're moving across the globe, we're moving to a place that Jimmy spent a lot of his life in. He went to Paris in 1948. He bought the house in the south of France in 1971. He kept that house until he passed in 87. But he was more of what a lot of people who have described what he did in his movement, a transatlantic commuter. He was not in exile. He was not an expatriate. He had very severe reactions to those words in terms of what they mean. And of course, many academics still love to use them. In fact, he spent a lot of time back and forth, and especially in the 60s into the 80s, because the Blues for Mr. Charlie opened on Broadway, his second play, and it was 64. And in 65, he bought a house that he could live in when he's in New York, but mainly for his mother and several members of the family. And it was on 71st Street between Columbus and Amsterdam. And it has now been designated as a landmark house. It's a simple 4-story house, white brick, nothing particularly beautiful, but it had 2 apartments on the floor and it had a garden out back. And over the years, he often would stay there. There are several things in New York that, in case you don't know about, I wanted to make sure you know, in case you feel like going there, sitting there, reading while you're there, and or thinking while you're there. And one of them is James Baldwin Place, which was designated a few years ago in, it's 128th Street between Park and Madison, and it's the street on which the house stands, the school stands, which is now called the Renaissance School, Harlem Renaissance School. And that has a street name sign, James Baldwin Place, and it was dedicated so in 2014. There is also the James Baldwin Lawn, which is now named next to the Langston Hughes Playground, which is at 135th Street in St. Nicholas Place. And it's a big expanse of a lawn right on the other side from City College. And then there is a plaque on the building that he used and lived in, didn't own, but he had an apartment in there over several years, 81 Horatio Street. So those are the places in New York City that have named where he was, where he went to, and so on. And there was a stamp ceremony held at the Schomburg many years ago to give him a stamp. And there was a big celebration there as well. And as you mentioned earlier, when Little Men was reissued, there were a lot of ceremonies around that particular book, and they were held at the Schomburg, but they were also held other places. So all of that has begun to be put out to the public, and has also increased the attention, of course, to his work and his legacy. So going back to the chapters that we were reading for now, let me just switch here. Okay, so Eric and Eve in the beginning, in book 2, we figure out what is going on with them. We figure out who they are. We are told who they are and how they have suffered through each of their own individual challenges within their own families and what has brought them together. And one of the phrases that I liked a lot that he uses is, he describes Eve as an able adventurer. And he's the one who's convincing Eric to go back to America to be in the play that he has an opportunity to act in, because he knows that in France, Eric is never going to get the kind of attention and recognition and advancement in his career that he has figured out Eric wants. And Eric didn't plan to go and marry him and or do anything at that point, because people were not getting married, men were not getting married to each other. But he loved the fact that Eric could live by his wits. Eric was extremely good looking, as he mentions, but at the same time, Eric was very much confused about what to do with his whole life in terms of whether to stay with Eve, because he feels great love for him. So through that section, we get to know a lot about Eric's fears, his conflicts, his traumas, and his relationship with Rufus surfaces as well. And Eric goes through growing up and his affection and relationship, which started with a man in the first time with a man named Henry who lived in the basement. And I thought that in that whole description, where his family is a well-off white family, and he lives in the South. He grows up with the privilege and advantages which have been portrayed in the book. And you begin to recognize the fears, the hidden secrets, and what you reveal and you don't reveal, what others see and what you think they don't see. And I particularly was intrigued by the way in which they try to figure out their own identity at an earlier age, but are unable to do so, but then they begin to get a sense later on. As we move on, Vivaldo and Ida's relationship gets revealed in terms of Vivaldo's own feelings about other men, but yet not acting on them. And yet he wants to be alone with Ida, and then he gets jealous, and they begin to have a lot of problems and issues about their own relationship. And how do they trust each other? Do they really feel complete together? And then we go on to look at how Cass then reaches out to Eric and begins a relationship with Eric, which was something she was feeling, thinking, and yet she knows that he had a relationship with Rufus and has relationships with men, but yet she's in great pain, but couldn't figure that out until she saw Eric again. So I love what Joanne said earlier about the trigger from Rufus's death, which then turns everybody into a different place to try to figure out what is making a difference in their own revealing of who they are and how they are with each other. And again, coming back to this statement, Vivaldo wonders where Ida is, and there's a quote in there: "Love is a country he knew nothing about." Yes, Richard, did you want to? Oh, I thought I see the little green thing around your face there, so I think you want to.
Oh, no. I was just
It
kind of
shows
going
up
into
on
the
the screen.
intensity of that, and just
Oh.
it was going through my mind. So
Well, I have
I was having
something,
I
Carol.
was having a moment.
Yeah, Joanne.
Okay. Yeah, with this, one of the things, and looking at the relationship between Eric and Henry, and then Leroy, and some of these other things, again, the honesty strikes me about how in all these relationships, the depth of racial attitudes in America, in the world,
Yep.
and how dangerous it is for Black people just to be people, because of how all of these other things react on them. Because I think about Eric in the South going by Leroy's house and the whole and clinging to Henry. And these are people who are just trying to survive as people to begin with all the things going on in their lives, with all the things going on in society related to their race and everything. And Eric is going through this, take care of me, almost, or be attentive to my wants and needs. And like when Leroy said, you know, I don't have a rich, you know, white father, and what they can do to me. And I was wondering, is this going to end up badly for Leroy at some point, you know, in this story or not? And the way the book and Baldwin explores that, I think that just is kind of like an undercurrent through everything of Rufus, Ida, just trying to be people.
Mhm.
And all of these people that they're connected to, whether it's through jealousies at times, protectiveness through times, love me through other times, etc., are and projecting all these things that they want from them on them without really understanding what they need to give to the people, Rufus or Ida, that they're, you know, engaging with. It's kind of like, it's almost parasitic. And so I think, you know, it just, again, the honesty of that and the depth of that is just striking me, and just really affecting me in reading this book, you know, and how he's telling this story without, you know, just dwelling on that alone, but dealing with their own individual human aspects of their conditions.
I think the word parasitic captures it very, very well. I think definitely Richard and Cass have that relationship. There's a comment where Cass reflects on the differences between her and Ida later on every level, especially when they go up to Smalls in Harlem together. And she realizes, quote, Richard had protected her from the wilderness of herself, which speaks again.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I said. Wow. Wow.
Would you mind reading that again? I'm sorry.
Alexis, huh?
Yes, would you mind reading that again?
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Cass reflects on the differences between her and Ida on every level and notes to herself. So she's thinking out loud, so to speak, because he wrote it. Richard had protected her from the wilderness of herself. No one is as they think they are among all these characters. I'm saying that. They're all living delusional lives. They're all alienated from themselves. And here's another one that I thought, it blew me away anyway, rereading it again. And this is page 363, by the way. The loss of intimacy with one person results in the freezing over of the world and the loss of oneself. And terrifying that the terms of love are so rigorous, its check and liberties so tightly bound together. Sheesh. Good one, Alexa.
I'm like, wow. Can I ask a question? I mean, I feel like I know the answer already because I can just kind of see it in the videos that I've seen of him. But do you think that even with the circles that he has cultivated and the, you know, the friendships that he's cultivated, that Baldwin was inherently a lonely man?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you why I think so. An awful lot of academics have said that. They've written that. They've interpreted that. And I'm going to say no. I think he experienced loneliness, as all of us do, to varying degrees at different times. So yeah, I think at times, oh yeah, he was lonely. At times, he reached out to those who expressed love, those who wanted to be with him. He had to fulfill the lonely needs we all have. But I don't think of him, nor see him, nor remember him as a man who was lonely in a simplistic sense, but rather in an extremely deep, complex way, because he went to the depths of his soul and his heart to try to figure out how to create the person he became. And that, of course, was an extremely lonely journey, but he also missed enormously his family a great deal, because he did choose to spend more of his time away than with them, but they came there, he went there, and it wasn't what a lot of people describe as, in fact, you know, the way he lived. So on a personal level, I do think that he experienced loneliness, but I don't ever describe him as a lonely man, other than he went to the depths of everything that means and can mean, and figured out how to be fulfilled in the ways he could be. And that meant that he had all kinds of friends. He had all kinds of ways of satisfying his needs. He loved music. He loved to sit and talk for hours and over food. He loved to travel. He loved to constantly experience new things. He went so far as to go to Russia before he died, because Gorbachev, just consider that now. To me, that has always been amazing, but he went with his brother David to Gorbachev because Gorbachev loved his work and wanted to meet him. And he went there. And the fact that he would do that, and the fact that he recognized and respected that global interest and that global acceptance, and the intellectual capacity to do that, and the intellect that he was, as well as the practical, down home, honest, moral human being he was. So that's my somewhat complicated, convoluted take on what I think, for whatever that matters.
Well, it matters a great deal to me because you answered a question that I had.
Oh, okay, well.
So I appreciate you.
I'm sure there are people who disagree with me, but that's fine.
Well, I thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. I mean, all your questions and comments have been extraordinarily insightful and helpful since we've been talking. And so I thank you for all you've contributed as well. Any other thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I have just finished reading The Three Mothers by Anna Malaika Tubbs.
Right.
And, it is, it's a thin book, it was her dissertation for Cambridge.
Right.
But what I felt very strongly is supportive of what you were just saying about James Baldwin, because of his incredibly deep love, and more than that, like connection with his mother, Bertus.
Right.
You know, that to me supports amongst, you know, everything else we've been saying in the space about his friends and just the incredibly broad array of friends,
Mhm.
and chosen not because of their intellect necessarily, but for, you know, some people do choose that way. I have a lot of friends in academia who
Mhm.
choose that way.
Mhm.
But that's not how he chose. And I think that was something, even in this thin book of the three mothers, that comes clear. And, you know, again, I stalked Burtis after that to find out more about her. I mean, besides the fact that she, you know, grew up in Deal Island, Maryland, and what that means to me and what the author of this book also attributed to her. But I stalked her, the little bit there is of her, and
Mhm.
discovered that they are lying in the same grave site, side by side,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Hartdale, New York, in that cemetery.
Ferncliff.
I was shocked to see that they
Why?
are in the same.
Why?
It just, to me, it spoke to a relationship that was not to be broken. It's just amazing. As much as my son loves me and I love my son, that's not how we're going down, okay?
I love that one. Thank you for that very, very much. That was wonderful. Okay, so to that point, I'll add a little more fact. Ferncliff Cemetery is in Hartsdale or Ardsley, depending on where you look at it from. And Ferncliff Cemetery is where everyone in the family is buried, including such people as Paul Robeson, Malcolm X, and a whole lot of other folks. It's when you are buried there, you have the choice. I know this only because I'm going to be put there when I'm gone, and I don't have that much longer around. So you have a choice of being buried in one grave by yourself or with another two-person grave. And then they have sections like the Jewish cemetery and as other cemeteries have. In the case of his burial, Burtis lived until 98 and a half years old. Jimmy only lived until 62 and a half. All those years later, the family knew that he would want to be with her. She was the extraordinary example, model, reason he became the man he became. And she is the epitome of love, was the epitome of love, and in every way, shape, or form. She was an extraordinary woman. She knew that he was a writer and needed to write and supported it. And she, whenever anyone would interact with her, she would accept you as you are, as you came to her, as you are, and part of the friends and family, depending on the relationship. So you're absolutely correct in picking that up. I knew about the book. I haven't read it. I don't think I will. There's no way that young women, give her credit for what she does, could have known. But that's the reason why they're in the same grave. It's also true for two of his brothers, George and Wilma, otherwise known as Lover. They're also in a grave with two in the grave. And David is a little bit down the road from there in a grave by himself. And some of it has to do with the way that cemetery puts aside plots and when people buy them and all that sort of thing. So they're all not immediately next to each other, but they're close by. But I hope that clarifies a little bit there. But I do want to emphasize that the love he learned and the reason he was such an extraordinary loving human being was because of his mother and the values that she lived, not just said, but lived and demonstrated. And it's a great example of how mothers and fathers can do that. Any other comments, thoughts? So, oh, we're almost over here. Okay, so a couple of quick additional thoughts I wanted to throw out. There's a review that was written about another country considerable time ago, and I found it in the Bosphorus Review of Books. And the reason I looked at it was because it was the Bosphorus Review of Books. And I have actually been to Istanbul, Turkey, and I have actually visited the house in which he lived. And I actually stayed there over the summer of '67. And in the Bosphorus Review of Another Country, which is a very positive review, contrary to a lot of other reviews that I've read, and I don't mean positive or negative in the sense of bad or good, I mean just intelligent for that matter, at least from my perspective. There's a comment that the man who wrote it said about this book, among other things. Sex is political and sex is salvation. So I wanted to throw that out as a more final thought and ask you to comment on that in terms of this book and identity and alienation and all the things we've talked about. Anyone?
Can you repeat the quote again, please?
Sex is political. Sex is salvation.
I think that the political aspect of it is how we sort of take sides as far as sexuality, not just sex, but also sexuality is defined and also bracketed and commodified in a sense that, you know, the church sees it one way, liberal, quote unquote, liberal thinkers see it another way. So maybe that's what it was referring to. Even though it's at the end of the day, if you're doing it right, it should be pleasurable. But because all of these forces are making it political, I don't know, maybe that was the intention.
I don't know, Alexis wrote, depends on who you're having sex with.
That is true.
So,
I made the assumption that it's pleasurable for most people. So.
Alexis, I love
Yeah.
that one.
I didn't necessarily want to get on camera to say that, but I just feel like the
can
first
say
part, it is
anything you want.
political.
We know what you look like.
No,
It just
go
depends
ahead.
on, like, when I said that, I was just saying, like, with the political aspect, yes, it depends on who you're having sex with, because the roles that are played with that, right? Like, it can be extremely political, even if you're having heterosexual sex, because, you know, the roles that, you know, are involved with that. But I think that last part, well, we all know what, you know, that last one, I don't know. It just depends. And I want to say also, like, with the education that people are not receiving, particularly now, how folks are really trying to disengage young people from understanding and building out their consent, their understanding of their own bodies and their own sexuality, you know, being engaging in sexuality or not. They are just being held back from it as if it is it's going to activate something that's literally going to activate anyway. how that has made it political. And if you even want to consider sex to be, if you want to consider also gender in there as well, like the actual like secondary sexual organs, like we're not even talking about intersex folks, like as if like there's not a spectrum, so people don't even want to talk about it. It's that like I said, it's a loaded thing, and I'm I'm gonna turn my camera off now.
So I'm wondering if,
And we're all adults here, okay?
Right?
sometimes anyway.
Sometimes, right?
Especially when
one.
you're having sex.
Good one, good one.
Well, it is a time of playfulness and joy for many. Okay, so I'm wondering if, because it just occurred to me because of the conversation, Carol.
Yeah.
If political is another way of talking about hierarchical.
Love that. Hierarchical. Well, when you think about how it plays out in this book in particular, that is a really deep, worthy, sharp level of thinking about the interactions that they have with each other. So think about how how Rufus has the first experience with Leroy, and then I'm sorry, was it Eric, and then the other experiences that happen in each of the characters as they move through their age in the book and their relationships with each other, and who dominates who, and who reacts to who, and how does that play out in terms of hierarchy and power, hence political, hence personal. I don't have any good answers for that or any, insight that I think is any better than anyone else's. It's just from my own experience of my 81 years on this planet. But in general, I think people do play roles with each other. I think they play out their needs with each other, and how that plays out in these particular characters. And especially when you think about, these are people who are real. They are not just characters in a book. I said last week that I don't believe there is such a thing as fiction. I think it's somebody's reality. And I do believe that one way or the other, and to what I know from my life, that Jimmy knew these people. He knew them all very well. And he was able to strip down who they were, how they were, and why they were. And that's what this book really tells us too, is this is a world that is full of people like this. And if we care about the world we live in and we want to make it a better place, we need to attend to owning up, as Joanne said in several ways earlier, the honesty of it.
Well,
So go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things with that honesty in terms of, thinking that with that comment, that you made is insightful. And the first encounter that Bovado and Ida had, with sex, that seemed to be a real attempt at intimacy and caring about each other, was in the first hope I got, because everything else seemed to be so external. in so many other ways in terms of the encounters and with the baggage people drug along with them, with the way people on the streets were looking at, the characters together and everything. And so the identity politics from society and from the characters themselves was very political, I thought, throughout most of it. And that point where Ida and Vivaldo just seemed to be about them, I was like, oh, maybe there's some hope here, with all of this. And I'm hoping this continues in this way. But I do think that comment was, extremely insightful for that, reviewer to say, talk about the politics of it. And again, only somebody who is truly truthful, and I think that with Baldwin as a universal citizen, from how you were describing him earlier, that to be able to be with people and accept people for who they are and still have some love for them without being delusional about what people are, is a real sense of spiritual and life maturity that I don't know if most of us ever get to, but I see in this writing.
Yeah, and particularly the relationships between men and women play out on all of those levels. Remember when Vivaldo is thinking about him going to the women he goes to, and why he goes to Black women versus white women. And then his relationship with Ida turning out to be extremely potentially combative. And then how it plays out in actual verbal combativeness. And she tells him men don't understand men. I mean, men don't understand women and women don't understand men. That's pretty heavy and pretty important, I think, in the scheme of all of this, in terms of thinking about identity and how we deal with each other in terms of power, hierarchy, and everything else, and our roles that we play in the relationships and the society that we live in.